Thanksgiving started the same way it always did, with my mom reminding me that the stuffing used to be her specialty, before I came along and ruined family traditions with my tofu recipes and moral high ground. She said it with a laugh, which meant I wasn't allowed to take offense, even though she'd said the same thing every year since I turned vegetarian at 19. The table was dressed like a Pottery Barn catalog: eucalyptus leaves, gold-rimmed chargers, wine poured before grace. I slid into my usual seat at the far end, between the piano nobody plays and Carol, her friend with the loudest whisper. "Still doing the volunteer work?" Carol asked, her tone dipped in Chardonnay. "She likes to feel useful," my mom answered for me, cutting her turkey with a little more force than necessary. "It's a nonprofit," I said, calm and careful, the way I always was around them. "Oh, right," Carol nodded, eyes already back on the candied yams, "but you're not paid, right?" The air felt tight for a second, then loosened with polite laughter, like we were all pretending we didn't just hear what we heard. Mom didn't look at me, just reached for the salt with her left hand, the one with her ring turned inward, even though my father had been gone 13 years. I wondered if she even remembered she did that. I hadn't told her I'd just returned from Jordan last week, or that I'd slept 3 nights on a concrete floor beside a boy who'd lost his sister crossing the border. She didn't ask. She was focused on the cranberry sauce, the one from the can, cut perfectly along its ridges like some kind of factory truth. "You could have been anything," Mom said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "You had the grades for med school, didn't you?" I nodded, pressing my tongue to the roof of my mouth to stop myself from replying. The silence felt safer than explaining, again, why I'd walked away from Johns Hopkins, why I'd chosen to build something smaller, slower, harder. "You know," she added, "Michelle's daughter just got hired at that biotech startup, the one doing immunotherapy. Her signing bonus was more than I made in a year." I said nothing, just smiled and cut my sweet potato into even pieces. Across the table, Carol's husband scrolled his phone, barely hiding his boredom. Conversation turned to books none of them had finished and politics they only understood through headlines. I stared at the butter dish, its tiny curls melting against porcelain. "You must miss having coworkers," someone said. I think it was that woman from the HOA, the one who always called me Mia. "I do have coworkers," I said. "They just don't wear Patagonia vests." A small laugh, but not from my mom. Her face was frozen, like she hadn't decided yet if that was funny or rude. Then it happened. A sharp inhale from Carol's left, followed by a clatter of cutlery as her phone tilted upright. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Mira, is this you?" She turned the screen toward the group, the glow catching my mother's cheekbones, illuminating her expression like a backlit confession. There it was, my face beside a headline: Agra Project founder awarded $15 million grant, nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. The room fell into a stunned hush. You could hear the hum of the wine fridge in the corner. My mom didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her face drained of color, her fork hovered midair. Carol blinked twice, phone still up like proof. "Is this real?" she asked, softer now. "It's real," I said, not looking at anyone in particular. Someone coughed. The sound was sharp in the quiet. My mother swallowed, hard, like something bitter had just lodged in her throat. "Well," she finally said, clearing her voice, "she's always been passionate." Laughter came too late, awkward and thin. My hands stayed folded in my lap. It wasn't anger I felt. It wasn't even pride. It was something colder. A space that had opened inside me, the size of her silence. I excused myself before dessert, stepping out into the back garden where the lights cast soft yellow shadows across the lawn. My breath fogged in the November chill, my chest still tight from holding myself upright at the table. Inside, I could hear them begin to talk again, this time about me. Their tone had shifted. I could tell. But the truth was, that headline changed nothing in that house. I was still the girl who disappointed her mother. Just one with a bigger title now and no seat at the real table. The dining room settled into a strange quiet, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing, and my mother kept her face tilted toward her plate as if the turkey might reveal instructions for how to recover her pride, while the others whispered my name like it had just been invented, soft and disbelieving. Carol leaned toward me with bright, hungry eyes, asking when I'd known about the nomination, and the question floated in the space between us without landing because my mother's fork scraped porcelain, and she finally murmured, "She likes to keep things private," as if privacy had been her accusation minutes earlier. My cousin Eli, who usually limits himself to sports talk, spoke first, saying, "Mira, why didn't you tell us something this big?" With a tone that wasn't judgment exactly, more confusion threaded with a hint of hurt, and I opened my mouth to answer, but hesitated when I saw my mother's jaw tighten, her nails tapping the stem of her wine glass. She looked like someone bracing for a truth she wasn't sure she could survive, so I gave the gentlest version, saying, "I didn't know when it would go public, and even that felt like a betrayal somehow." The room's energy began rearranging itself around me, people leaning closer, asking questions that clattered against each other, and my mother's silence grew heavier with every compliment directed my way. I caught her watching me with a kind of unfamiliar calculation, the kind she uses when comparing home flooring estimates, and she whispered to Carol, "She always downplays things, pretending this new narrative had existed all along." I looked at her then, really looked, and saw the smallest flicker of something fragile beneath her performance, something like fear wrapped in pride wrapped in shame. Dinner resumed awkwardly, forks clinking in strange rhythms, and the conversation bounced from one half-started topic to another until the man from the HOA turned to me and said, "So, what exactly does your nonprofit do?" With the tone of someone asking for proof I deserved the oxygen in the room. My mother's head lifted sharply, her expression pleading with me to answer in a way that made her look good, and I felt that old familiar tug inside me, the urge to protect her from embarrassment even when she never extended me the same mercy. Before I could respond, my Aunt Lonnie chimed in, saying she'd seen a video of our youth center's reopening and that the kids looked unbelievably happy, her voice softening with something that felt genuine, which startled me because rarely anyone here had touched the truth of my world. My mother gave a tight smile as though she'd supervised the project herself, and she added quickly, "Myra's always been good with children, reducing years of trauma work to a personality trait." I watched her hands trembling slightly around her napkin, the folds creasing under pressure she didn't acknowledge. Eli pushed his chair back a little, asking if the grant meant I'd move abroad permanently, and his question produced a ripple across the table because the idea of me leaving for good hadn't occurred to them until now. My mother's head snapped toward him so fast I felt the air shift, and she said, "She lives here," with a certainty she had not earned. I met her eyes carefully, feeling the sharp edge of what she didn't say, the dread of losing even the version of me she didn't appreciate, and the room tightened again around that unspoken truth. When dessert was served, the caramel tart she bought instead of baked sat untouched in front of her, its glossy surface reflecting the chandelier like a second, smaller moon, and she kept staring at it as if it might rescue her. She whispered, "I didn't know," so quietly I almost wondered if she meant to say it aloud, and I nodded because arguing would have felt cruel in that moment. Her voice wasn't defensive anymore, it was thin and unfamiliar, carrying a tremble that slipped past the armor she'd worn all evening, and something in my chest ached with unexpected softness. The table slowly emptied as people drifted into the living room for coffee, leaving just the two of us at opposite ends, and the distance between us felt like its own landscape, wide and unsteady. She looked across the table with eyes that seemed older than this morning, asking, "Why didn't you tell me first?" And the question caught me off guard because it wasn't scolding, it was wounded. I swallowed hard, choosing my words carefully, saying, "You hadn't asked about my work in a long time," and the silence that followed was so still it almost felt sacred. The house quieted after everyone left, warm lights dimmed to a softer glow, and Mom moved through the kitchen gathering plates with a focus that felt almost like avoidance, her shoulders stiff under the weight of too many unspoken things. I offered to help, though she didn't usually let me, and she surprised me by handing me a stack of dessert plates without a word. The silence between us wasn't sharp anymore, just thick, like dust stirred from old furniture. While rinsing the glasses, she said carefully, they didn't need to make it such a spectacle, pretending annoyance instead of discomfort. I dried the glasses slowly, watching her reflection in the window as she wiped the counter with deliberate, circular motions, and she finally asked, "How long have you known about all this?" keeping her voice light even though her hands trembled just enough to betray her. I told her about the board meeting weeks ago, the grant committee discussions, the email from Geneva that arrived at 3 in the morning. She listened without interrupting, her face softening at the edges, and something in her eyes flickered with the kind of pride she wasn't ready to show publicly. When the kitchen was clean, she walked into the living room where stray napkins were left like little flags of earlier conversations, and she paused by the fireplace before saying, "People will assume I knew, they'll think I was hiding it to be modest." And I realized she was rehearsing a version of the evening she hoped others would remember. I watched her adjust a vase that didn't need adjusting, her fingers tracing its handle as if convinced it offered stability, and she added, "I should have said something earlier when they asked," even though she hadn't known what to say. She sank onto the couch with a sigh that carried fatigue and something closer to vulnerability, and she said, "I've always wanted you to have stability, Mira, that's all," as if the explanation could cover every earlier dismissal. I sat on the ottoman in front of her, close enough to see how her mascara had smudged at the corners, and she continued, "I wasn't trying to belittle your work," choosing her words with that careful tone she used when trying to rewrite a moment in real time. Her honesty hovered somewhere between apology and self-defense. I told her gently that I understood she meant well even when it didn't feel that way, and her expression softened, her shoulders loosening as if she'd been waiting years to hear that. She pressed her lips together before whispering, "I always wanted a life for you that felt easy," then laughed quietly at how impossible that sounded, since ease had never been the point for either of us. She touched my hand lightly, almost hesitantly, and said, "I should have asked more," the words slipping out like a truth she hadn't realized she was carrying. Our conversation paused when her phone buzzed with a message from Carol, probably already spinning the evening into gossip-ready lines, and Mom read it with a tight smile before setting the phone face down. She looked at me again, this time without the performance she'd worn earlier, and she said, "People will want to talk about you," almost like a warning. I shrugged and told her it wasn't about attention, and she nodded slowly, absorbing the idea with a seriousness she hadn't shown before, as if seeing me through a lens that didn't distort my choices. She asked me then, quietly, "Does the work ever scare you?" And the question felt real, stripped of judgment, carried by a mother's worry rather than critique. I told her the truth, that parts of it did, and her breath caught slightly, her hands clasping together in her lap. She listened intently as I explained the families we served, the children who reminded me of pieces of myself, and the way I sometimes wished she could have seen the people I'd met, the ones who shaped me in ways a resume never could describe. The fireplace cast a soft orange glow around her, coloring her features with warmth I hadn't associated with her in years, and she leaned back into the couch cushions as if surrendering to a tenderness she rarely allowed herself. She said, "I'd like to understand your world better," almost shyly, and the sincerity in her voice surprised me. I told her she could, whenever she wanted, and her relief showed in the way her shoulders dropped. The space between us felt smaller now, woven not from obligation, but from something that looked a little like hope. I stayed the night at Mom's because she asked in a way that felt smaller than usual, her voice softer, almost hopeful, and the guest room still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she tucked in drawers like protective charms. While I settled into the old quilt, my phone buzzed with a notification from an address I hadn't seen in 13 years, and I just stared at the subject line, "Still you," letting the weight of those 2 words press into my chest. The room felt suddenly too quiet, filled with the humming ache of a past I'd tucked away. I opened the email slowly, my hands trembling just enough that I had to steady the phone against my knee, and there he was, writing to me like we had never paused at all. He said he'd watched the interview clips circulating online, said my voice reminded him of his mother, the grandmother I barely remembered yet apparently carried in my cadence. He wrote that he'd always known I would step into something meaningful, that he regretted not being around to witness it unfold. Reading his words felt like touching a scar I hadn't realized was still tender. He attached a single photo, a grainy snapshot from when I was 7, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Protect the weak," my hair uneven from Mom's rushed trimming attempts. I could see his shadow in the corner of the frame, the faint outline of him kneeling as he centered the camera, and the memory surfaced in a slow, aching wave, carrying his laughter and the warmth of a summer day that felt impossibly far away. It amazed me that he'd kept this photo all those years, preserved like a tiny fossil of who I used to be. Mom knocked on the door then, gentle and uncertain, asking if I needed an extra blanket because the house sometimes ran cold at night, and I quickly locked my phone without thinking. She stepped inside with one folded over her arm, offering a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She said, "It's been good having you here," as though I were a guest instead of a daughter, and I thanked her softly. The space between us felt tender, quieter than usual, shaped by both the evening's revelations and all the years we'd tiptoed around the deeper things. After she left, I sat up and reread the email twice, absorbing each sentence until the words settled somewhere beneath my ribs, warm and confusing and strangely comforting. Memories flickered like restless birds, of him teaching me how to skip stones, of Mom calling me inside too quickly, of the arguments that cracked our house open back then. He didn't mention the divorce, didn't mention why he stayed away, and I felt the familiar mix of relief and ache, as if silence had stitched itself between us long ago and neither of us had dared pull at the thread. I typed a reply slowly, hesitating at every line break, unsure if gratitude would feel too weak or if honesty would feel too sharp, settling instead for something simple: "Thank you for reaching out. I'm glad you saw it." Before hitting send, I wondered how Mom would react if she knew he'd written, whether it would reopen something she'd spent years burying, or whether she'd pretend it didn't matter at all. Sending the message felt like stepping onto a fragile bridge, one built between a life I understood and a life that still held unanswered echoes. The house creaked softly as I lay back, the way it did in winter when the beams contracted, and I could hear Mom moving around in the hallway, opening and closing drawers as if searching for some lost piece of herself. I wondered if she replayed the dinner in her mind, questioning the small ways she dismissed me, or if she simply wanted to reclaim the space that had shifted when everyone learned who I'd become beyond her expectations. The weight of the day pressed into my limbs, each moment settling like dust across my skin. I finally drifted towards sleep with the photo of my 7-year-old self still glowing faintly on the nightstand screen, that earnest little girl holding a sign almost too heavy for her arms. She had seemed so sure of the world, certain that goodness was something you could shape with your hands if you just worked hard enough. Lying there in my childhood home, caught between my mother's softening edges and my father's unexpected reappearance, I felt something steady inside me, something that whispered that maybe, even after everything, I was still that girl. Just carrying a larger story now. Morning light slipped through the guest room curtains in soft stripes, warming the quilt near my knees, and I woke slowly, feeling the leftover weight of last night's conversations still pressing against my ribs. Mom was already in the kitchen, humming in a way she didn't realize she did when trying to convince herself everything was fine. I followed the sound, padding down the hallway, and she looked up as I entered, startled for a second before offering a smile that felt gentler than usual. "Sleep okay?" she asked, voice low, as though the morning couldn't handle anything louder. She poured me coffee, adding the exact amount of sugar I used in high school, which made my chest tighten with a kind of familiar ache, and we stood there in an unhurried quiet until she finally said, "You were always going to leave home early. I think I knew that," her fingers tapping the counter lightly. I leaned against the fridge, watching her adjust the kettle's position even though it didn't need adjusting, and she added, "I didn't know how to keep up with you," her tone drifting between confession and apology, threaded with something unexpectedly tender. I told her that I hadn't expected her to keep up, that I just wanted her to see me even when she didn't fully understand my choices, and she exhaled in a shaky breath as if that truth had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. She walked to the sink, gripping the edge with both hands like grounding herself, and she whispered, "I get scared when you're far away," letting the sentence unravel softly. Hearing that shifted something in me, because under all her judgments, there had been fear, tangled and tight, shaping how she loved me. While we ate breakfast, my phone buzzed again with a new message from Dad, shorter this time, asking if he could call sometime, and Mom noticed the way my gaze lingered on the screen. Her voice stalled before she asked, "Is it him?" carrying a mixture of curiosity and something else, something older. I nodded, setting the phone face down, and she swallowed hard before saying, "You don't have to hide that from me," surprising us both with the softness in her tone. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, wrapped in memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. She moved to the stove, stirring the eggs even though they were nearly done, and said, "I didn't know how to explain things back then," her voice trembling slightly as though each word carried its own history. I waited quietly, letting her speak at her own pace, and she continued, "Your father loved you, even when he didn't love me anymore," as if the sentence had been waiting years to be released. Hearing her say his name without bitterness felt like a door opening in a long-locked hallway, letting light spill over familiar shadows. We sat together at the table, both of us stirring food we weren't quite ready to eat, and she asked if I'd respond to him, her tone steady, but her eyes revealing a flicker of worry. I said I already had, telling her it felt right to acknowledge him after all this time, and she nodded with a kind of quiet acceptance that surprised me. "You don't owe me explanations," she murmured, and something warm unfurled between us, softer than forgiveness yet shaped from the same cloth. It felt like she was offering space instead of control. I reached across the table, resting my hand near hers, not touching, just close enough to bridge the distance, and she looked at our hands with a mixture of grief and relief woven together. She whispered, "I'm proud of you," and the words caught at the edges, like she hadn't practiced them enough for them to fit easily in her mouth, yet they landed with a weight that felt steady and real. Her voice warmed as she added, "Tell me more about your work sometime," and it wasn't a performance, just genuine curiosity blooming in the quiet. After breakfast, I stepped outside into the crisp air, watching my breath rise in thin white ribbons while the morning settled around me, calm and bright. A message from one of our teens pinged through, a photo of her acceptance letter to a community arts program we'd helped her apply for, her proud smile filling the screen. I felt something in my chest loosen, a sense of alignment threading through my ribs, and as I walked back toward the house, I realized that quiet mornings like this, built from small truths and gradual softening, were their own kind of homecoming.